Welcome. This is MBA 522, and this lecture is Introduction to Decision Making, as we talk about the decision-making process and specifically how we make ethical decisions. So we just listened to that little video clip about Jonah Lehrer and some of the challenges that he had with making decisions. So let's go to the formal definition. What is decision making? And decision making is when we have to choose actions from among multiple feasible alternatives. So the goal here is we have to look at all the possibilities that may be out there that are feasible, and then ultimately choose among those to figure out what the next step will be. Of course, that opens up a lot of questions and challenges for us. Number one, do we have all the alternatives available for us? And if we do, are they always feasible? What happens if we don't have a chance to plan? We still have to make decisions, but we don't have an opportunity to take some time in advance to think about our options or to actually critically analyze these things. Next, people say, well, we should make a logical or rational decision. And of course, as we already know from the lecture from Jonah Lehrer, that rational and logical is not always the right approach. But even if we do choose rational and logical, it's rational and logical according to whom? Which of course opens up the question, is it really then easy to do a rational or logical decision? And of course, according to Jonah Lehrer, that's not true. And as we'll see through this class, that's not always true. What may be rational or logical to you is not going to be rational or logical to somebody else. In this slide, we're going to look at the traditional analytical model of decision making. Specifically, there's 8 steps that we typically follow, from identifying the problem to evaluation of the outcomes. Many times, these things can happen almost simultaneously, and certainly in a crisis, this process is short-circuited. And in fact, it comes very quickly. We tend to not generate a lot of alternatives and evaluate a lot of alternatives when we're in crisis mode, particularly if we don't have any clarity as to what's going on and why. We're more putting out fires, if you will. But the basic step-by-step process is, first we have to identify our problem, then we have to figure out the objectives for what we need to do to solve this problem. Sometimes we'll make a pre-decision, we'll start thinking about what it is that we'd like to accomplish, and that then directs us into generating and evaluating all the alternatives. And we want to make sure when we're evaluating the alternatives, we're not just thinking short-term, but we're thinking about the long-term impact of what we do. That's where a lot of mistakes happen, is when we only think in the short term, when in fact we have a long scope to be thinking about what impact we're going to have. Ultimately, after we do our evaluations, we make a decision on which alternative we're going to use. We implement that, and then of course we have to evaluate to see whether or not it makes sense to do this. So while this is a very sort of linear 8-step process, we can take our time. Sometimes we can take our time going through this, and sometimes it's a very short period of time in which these things occur. But typically we try to at least identify the problem, define the objectives, get our alternatives out there, and then make our choice. The follow-up, the evaluation, if you will, can usually happen over a longer period of time. The next slide that we're looking at now is trying to understand how individual differences affect decision making. And what we're showing you here in this next slide is 4 different types of decision making styles: directive, analytical, conceptual, and behavioral. The directive style is definitely a style for someone who needs to make very quick decisions, because they do this very rapidly. They don't really consider a lot of alternatives. They have very clear rules for making decisions, and they move very quickly through the process. In this circumstance, this works really, really well when you have a crisis or when you have a lot of pressure to make a decision quickly. It works less well when you have a lot of time and leisure, and it's a costly decision, so you want to take more time to think about all your alternatives and think about what might be an appropriate outcome. The analytical is sort of the opposite of the directive. The analytical likes the problem solving. They like to take their time and dig in and look at all the alternatives and assess what works and what doesn't work, and really try to be creative in the way that they handle solving some of these problems. Their work, again, the very opposite of the directive. When you have time, when money is important, when the costs for making a bad decision are really high, you want to take your time. You want the analytical decision maker. The downside of the analytical decision maker is that they will be more likely to engage in paralysis by analysis. In a situation with paralysis by analysis, they will get caught up in doing analyzing and may forget that they actually have to make a decision. And so you can imagine sitting on a team where you've got a directive person and an analytical person, and between the two of them, one wants to make decisions really quickly, the other one wants to take their time and analyze, and so they are in conflict with each other. It's a constant fight back and forth to make that happen. So, I'm sure you're all laughing now thinking about your own meetings where this kind of thing occurred. The next type of individual decision-making style is the conceptual style. And the conceptual style is much more focused on making sure people are getting along, and also making sure that we're thinking about the big picture, the big concept. So the conceptual people are really great idea generators, and they come up with these creative ideas, but they're really not good in the trenches getting it implemented and pushing it through. So they take a very creative approach to stuff, but at the end, it really is your analyzers that are very good at digging down into researching the possibilities of whether or not this is an option that's going to work. So they analyze the possibilities, and they make suggestions that the conceptual person can then hold on to, and then hopefully they will help implement. So you can see how they might work in conjunction with each other. Although they do very different things, they work together to bring the pie in the sky ideas, if you will, and ground them in reality by doing some really good analytical research. The behavioral is the last style, and the behavioral one is more focused on process. They're very concerned for the organization and for the members of the group, and so what they're focused on is making sure that the process works right and it works fair, and that everybody has a voice in that situation, that they are good at setting up meetings and making sure the meetings work well, and getting everything done as quickly as possible. Whereas the directive person is ready to get out there and get things done as quickly as possible, the behavioral person is saying, slow down, we need buy-in from people, we need everybody's voice. And so they also may work hand in hand with the analytical folks, because the analytical folks want to be able to do the research, and the behavioral person is saying, let's make sure everybody's voice is heard. So they're the ones sort of advocating to make sure that the analytical person's voice is being heard in the process. Each of us may have a default style, if you will. I might be more analytical as a rule, or you might be more conceptual as a rule, but in the end, as a good leader, as a good manager, you have to recognize when you have to put on your directive hat and when you put on your behavioral hat, when an analytical style makes better sense than a conceptual style, or when they might work best together. You should learn how to adapt your style based on what the situation needs. If you can't do that, at the bare minimum, what you need to do is recognize that if you're analytical and you need a directive person to get through and make decisions quickly, that's what you want to put your emphasis on. You want to say, look, I need you to do this. We need to make a decision. You're really good at assessing a situation quickly and making a good decision, and whereas I take more time, so that's how we want to do it. And again, you may decide that the directive style works well. So even if you're not directive yourself, or you're not conceptual yourself, or you're not behavioral or analytical, but the style requires one of those, you know when to take a step back and let that person on your team who's good at that shine. So obviously, we'd all like to be able to develop the skills to be broad in our decision-making styles, but if we can't do that, the second best thing is to recognize when that style is appropriate and to take the step back and recognize that, this style is more appropriate in this situation, and that's not my strength, so I'll take that step back. While we talked about individual differences like decision-making style in the last slide, this slide is getting at more detail on context, which we're actually going to address in the second module for the class. We'll talk more in detail about how people perceive things and what is that perceptual process. How does that influence why and how people see things very differently. You and I could see the same set of events, but I might see it one way and make attributions in one way, and you might see and make attributions in a very different way. Our individual personalities, our attitudes, our values, all of these things influence the way that we make decisions. And within the context of values, it comes integrity and ethics. Other issues, culture, cultural differences, not only national cultural differences, but the culture of your company individually. Every company has a very unique culture. Some things are very explicit, some things are very implied, but nonetheless, these cultural differences really influence how quickly decisions get made, why decisions get made in a certain way, what factors should be weighted heavily because the culture of the business says that this is the more important approach to take. Lastly, structure and design. We'll go into different kinds of organizational structures and designs and some of the strategic reasons why we might organize ourselves in a particular way. What you're going to get in your reading is that we have to decide the kinds of decisions that we need to make in our organization, and then, and only then, do we then decide what the design and structure of the organization should be. A lot of times people will make a design or a structure and then try to make decisions around that, and that's backwards. We need to start with figuring out what's the decisions that we need to make and how do we build our structure to facilitate those decisions. So it's the decision-driven organization really gets at the importance of appropriate design. So how do individuals make decisions? We've talked about different decision-making styles. We've talked about how individual differences and culture and things like that influence decisions, but how do people actually make decisions? And what we have in this slide are two basic contrasting points of view. The first one is the rational economic model. And as you remember from the first audio clip that you were supposed to listen to from Jonah Lehrer, that rational economic model isn't always very rational because it assumes that we're making logic to maximize decisions, but in fact, we still have to tap into emotion. Logical machines don't always make the best decisions. For individuals to make decisions, we do have to allow emotion to come into play. So, of course, as much as Mr. Spock would argue that logic and pure logic and no emotion is the best way to make decisions, we know better. Live long and prosper, Mr. Spock and Leonard Nimoy. Really, in reality, while we should make decisions using the rational economic model, the bottom line is we are more likely to make decisions using the bounded rationality model. And what does that basically mean? It means that because we are very limited in our ability to process and gather information, we tend not to make optimal decisions, but we find the one that is minimally satisfying. So satisficing, sufficiently satisfying us. So suffice or satisfice is the way we work it. We can't find all the alternatives. It's not possible. The rational economic model works really, really well with very simple programmed decisions because we know all the options, we know all the goals, we know everything. It's all agreed on and it's available to us. But most decisions are more complex than that, and it requires us to use our emotions and past experience, and many times we're trying to make decisions without emotion, without experience, and with having to make a decision in this area in the first place. So our bounded rationality is really about finding the minimally satisfying solution. As long as it meets our minimum criteria, it addresses what we need, we will suffice. We will deal with it sufficiently satisfying to be able to use it. So you can see on the right hand side the little graphic, maximizers, people who are looking for the rational economic model to maximize goals. They exhaustively seek the best, they compare decisions with others, they expend an enormous amount of time and energy and are many times more unhappy with their outcomes. Whereas satisficers are looking at, is it good enough? Will it solve our issues? And when we're in a crisis or when we have unknown information, sometimes it's all you can do. Is it good enough? We may not be able to get to the optimal decision simply because we have multiple constituencies that we're trying to juggle. So we need to find the minimally satisfying solution for all the constituents that are involved. So satisficers accept good enough. They don't obsess about options. They move on. They leave it behind them and they keep going, and they tend to be more happier with outcomes. So when you're trying to really make the perfect decision, give it up. It's going to be very challenging to do, particularly when you have enormous numbers of variables that you're juggling in your head. And as again, going back to the Jonah Lehrer lecture, the struggle that one has is really around how do we address the fact that there are so many variables out there, that our brain is so limited, and that, emotions are going to play a role here. We don't want to have, paralysis by analysis. We don't want to have inertia in having an inability to make a decision because it's just too overwhelming. We want to be able to go in, make a decision as best as possible, and move on. So my guess would be that directive decision makers are much more likely to use bounded rationality. They look at what's minimally satisfying, they quickly assess the situation, and they move on through it, whereas analyzers tend more towards trying to find the best solution because they want to have all the information known. Again, that's not a rule of thumb, but you can see how that might map somewhat appropriately. In other slides talking about how do individuals make decisions, we've talked about bounded rationality, we've talked about the rational economic model. Intuition tends to be the way a lot of people make decisions. Now, intuition sort of has this reputation of somehow being this out of thin air, this idea comes and strikes us on the head, and suddenly we have this new idea that we never know where it came from. Well, it's not quite that simplistic. In reality, because our brain is this really huge, complex computer, and our frontal cortex can only handle a few pieces of information, there's a lot of data processing that's going on in the other parts of the brain, cerebral cortex and things like that. So the frontal cortex can only do so much. So the other part of the brain is doing the processing, but what it does is that it sort of taps you on the shoulder and says, hey, I processed this while you were not thinking about it, and I got this really cool idea. I think you need to listen to me. So your intuition sort of shoves itself in there. It seems like it's out of thin air, but in fact it comes from past experience, sort of outside of consciousness. What it basically is your body and your brain is processing the decades and decades of information that it's been gathering, and it's trying to predict what's the best solution to the problem. And so because so much is going on in the unconscious part of our brain, and it's sort of bubbling up to the consciousness, we call it intuition. But in fact, intuition is really, it's signaling to us. It's not coming out of nowhere. What we're getting with intuition is our body starts to respond. Our pulse might quicken, our stomach might flip, the hairs may stand up on our arms because all of a sudden we just have this idea and that something's coming together for us. And what's happening is it's moving from the unconscious to the conscious brain, and we're suddenly, it's getting shape, and we're pulling it all together, and then our conscious brain is starting to really sort through these things that we've had. But long before we get to that place, our body is really good at telling us when something is either really right or really wrong, trusting in our body to really inform us when something is not feeling good and we need to make a decision around it, or when something feels like it's a great option and we need to capitalize on that situation as quickly as possible. As we talk more about intuition and we talk more about mindfulness, and we'll address those issues together to some extent, you're going to notice that mindfulness is going to be an important part of being able to tap into our intuition. It's also an important tool that we need when we have very little known information in front of us, yet we still are being forced to make a decision. We've got to rely on our intuition. We've got to be mindful, present, quiet to the noise and really sort of see things with different eyes. And we'll get to some of that analogy in a little bit. While we've talked a bit about how individuals make decisions, most of the time we are working within groups to be able to make decisions, and we'll spend a class addressing different ways we make decisions within groups. There are pros and cons. Not every decision should be made by a group, so hence the comment, are more heads really better than one? Well, why or why not? Sometimes it is important to have multiple perspectives of individuals focusing on a project. You get more creative outcomes, you're more likely to address problem-solving issues, but here's the challenge. It takes more time, it takes more training. People tend towards risky decisions, as you can see from the graphic in the middle there. Groups will tend towards a risky shift because responsibility is dissolved and it is spread out amongst all the team members. And because we have greater emotional bonds with our team members, our anxiety goes down. So we are willing and capable of accepting more risk than any one of us individually would be willing to do on our own. So the group, it's sort of this collective shift upwards in the risk that people will take. So there's more risky decisions. We're more likely to experience things like groupthink, although there's some debate as to whether or not groupthink actually occurs. I think fundamentally there's lots of problems individually, whether or not you agree that groupthink exists. Individually, there are all sorts of examples of how some of the symptoms that people argue are part of groupthink are individually bad enough as they are. And we'll get and talk about that more when we get to our module on group decision making. And then lastly, of course, there's more conflict. We definitely see a situation where conflict is more of a problem because we have differing opinions and we have more challenges, which on the one hand is great to have different opinions, but to have the conflict is a problem. And the best thing that we can do in terms of managing groups and group decision making is teaching people how to deal with conflict resolution and how to negotiate and how to respect others' opinions and to learn how to talk through those. And so while I introduce these concepts here, when you get to the next class, MBA 523, you start learning how to put these tools to practice. You learn how to negotiate. You learn how to manage the conflict. You learn how to see the world from someone else's point of view and work better towards better agreements. The decision-making risk continuum is a great illustration of how we go from certainty, where everything seems to be known, we know the goals, we know the alternatives, we know the outcomes, and from that we can make a very easy programmed decision, very much like the rational economic model that we talked about a few slides ago. But as we have less and less information, as you can see from the points in red, we have under a decision made under risk, we're not clear about what outcome is going to happen. We may have some probabilities of this might happen, but we don't know for sure. Whereas in a situation where we're making a decision under certainty, we know what the outcome will be. If we do this, A will happen. If we don't do this, B will happen. With risk, it's not clear. It's possible it might happen, but it might not. And we don't have, it's a sort of a shifting, moving, target. We're not really clear, what the outcomes will be. As we move up and we have more and more missing information, now with making a decision under uncertainty, we might know what our goals are, but we might be looking at a circumstance where we're not really clear what the alternatives are because we don't have enough information, and we may not have all the information we need. And this is where, in this circumstance, when we're making decisions under uncertainty, and certainly in the next category, when we're making decisions under ambiguity, we have to really start tapping into our intuition and really seeing things with different eyes. Because when we allow ourselves to only be limited to a small vision in front of us, we will be handcuffed under those circumstances. So learning to be mindful, learning to tap into intuition, allowing ourselves to really see what's there and what's not there is going to be a big part of that. Lastly, of course, decisions under ambiguity. imagine that you're in a crisis situation. And that's really what we're going to talk about as we get to our last lecture on decision-making under ambiguity and decision-making under crisis, is we're not sure. I mean, I can tell you my own experiences, being in New York City on 9/11 and seeing buildings falling and people jumping from buildings and airplanes hitting buildings and not knowing what was going on, why it was going on. I didn't know what the goal was because I didn't know what was even why things were even happening. So we had to assess the situation. We still weren't clear why it was happening. We didn't know whether to run classes or to not run classes. Who even knew that the buildings were going to fall? All we knew is things were changing very quickly, and we had to react to the situation. And so that's a very ambiguous situation. Many crises are exactly that. When the crisis first occurs, it's very ambiguous. We aren't clear about the goals. We're not clear about alternatives because we don't even know what's going on in the first place. So there's no way you can come up with outcomes if you don't know where you're at. So we move from making decisions under uncertainty and ambiguity, and really what we're talking about is how to manage the unexpected. How do we prepare for the unexpected by definition, because it is not something we plan for. It's unanticipated. Can you plan for something that you don't anticipate, that you didn't even know was going to occur? Did anybody think that they needed to plan for the Boston bombing, during the Boston Marathon, or, the World Trade Center towers collapsing? How do you manage that? How do you be ready for that? As you saw from the video clip, the Did You Know clip, things are changing rapidly. And if things are changing that rapidly, our biggest challenge is how do we catch up? How do we make changes appropriately? How do we adapt to the speed at which things are changing? And that's where managing the unexpected becomes the focal point for a lot of decision nowadays. More and more decisions are made in that the realm of the unexpected and the unanticipated and the ambiguous. And so the tools that I want to teach you guys is to learn how to stand on your own 2 feet, to assess the situation, and to try to make a decision as quick as possible in that circumstance. This next slide deals with the 3 C's of decision making: constructive conflict, consideration, and closure. And all 3 of these are either things to engage in or things to be careful with. For example, in the closure issues, we don't want to decide too early or too late. We want to make sure we have just the right amount of time to be able to make the decision, taking longer when we need to and a shorter amount of time when it's less appropriate. For example, in a crisis, or when we're things have to move quickly. Constructive conflict, starting there, is about making sure that we allow for debate. Debate's good. Conflict in a small c is fine. It's when we get to a higher level of conflict where we find it's dysfunctional, that people are fighting with each other, they're not listening to each other. That's more of the problem. What we want is constructive criticisms. We want to have good debate. We want to make sure we don't make people feel defensive. We don't want to use terms like "you're stupid" or "that idea was dumb." We want to make sure that people who tend to create coalitions, right? This is not all Survivor. We're not playing Survivor. We're playing business. And when we get people to start working in little groups and coalitions, and they start working against the other group, that's going to create a problem when it comes to having rigorous, vigorous, appropriate debate about issues. So we have to be careful to not let these coalitions develop. And so the goal is, as a leader, is you want to divide those natural coalitions up so that people are spread out all over the place, enabling them to not have, an economy of scale, if you will, having them all together in one group, and suddenly they have, more voice than everybody else. We want to get people out of the old way of doing things. Well, we've always done it this way. This is the way we've always done things. Well, the world is changing, as we saw from that previous slide. Did you know? Because it's changing, old ways of doing things aren't going to work anymore. We have to make sure we bring an open mind to how to deal with this. And also, again, challenging these participants who are very stalemated to think about information. Are we thinking about it the same way? Are we thinking about it appropriately? When you're stuck, it's always important to go back to the beginning and rethink all the assumptions that you had. Maybe those assumptions are wrong. Maybe the assumptions need to be different. Maybe someone should have said something and they didn't, and now when you go back and revisit that key information, they feel more open and capable of expressing their concerns with the way things were headed. In terms of the second step, consideration, the idea is we want to give people appropriate consideration for their interpersonal behaviors. We want to make sure that we're listening actively, that we are open, not defensive, but open and to what people have to say. And importantly, when you are the decision maker, we need to make sure we are clear about the rationale behind our decision. You know, that adage of, because I said so, which, our parents, and I even use it myself as a parent, but, the thing that our parents would tell us when we were growing up, because I said so, so therefore you should do it. It just doesn't work in the business organization. These are adults with opinions of their own and ideas, and we need to respect that. You may not agree, but you certainly owe them an explanation for why things are done the way they are. If you go in it as you're omniscient and only your opinion works, that's going to be much more of a problem. You're not going to garner the respect of your employees when you do that. And then lastly, the closure issue. We want to be careful, as I said already, not making decisions too fast. For example, using a directive style when it's not appropriate, or making it too late, i.e. using a analytical style when it's not appropriate, when really we need to make decisions faster. So we've got to find where that sweet spot is in terms of how much information we can gather, in what amount of time, and when is the key point to be able to make that decision.